Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I really appreciate you being with me. So, as I promised, I only want to hit three really major points on Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, by way of summary of what we have seen in our more lengthy study of the Olivet Discourse. But you see, these verses, Matthew 24, 29 to 31, are in fact extremely critical for understanding the totality of New Testament eschatology. What happens in many commentators, especially amillennial, especially postmillennial, is they come to Matthew chapter 24 and they see what Jesus was saying in these verses, 20 verses 29 to 34. They recognize that the language is basically drawn from the Old Testament. The sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, etc. Well, that's straight out of Joel chapter 2. That's just a given. They see that the language of the sounding of the trumpet, the language of the gathering, right straight out of the Old Testament. And matter of fact, Colin Brown, in his Dictionary of the New Testament Theology, says while scholars have perplexed over these verses and whether or not Jesus made a false prediction, to come at the end of human history, he said that confusion would have been solved had it been recognized that Jesus was using typical Hebraic, apocalyptic, hyperbole, and metaphoric language to speak of his coming, empowered by the Father, with judgment prerogative, to use the Romans to come in judgment of Jerusalem and Old Covenant Israel, to wipe out their theocracy. So here we have this language of Matthew chapter 24 that scholars acknowledge, oh yeah, well, okay, that's AD 70. That's Hebraic apocalyptic language. Never intended to be taken literally. But then those same scholars come to 1 Thessalonians, which we talked about yesterday, and they say, that's different. Seriously? Folks, Paul said he got his eschatology from the Old Testament. His eschatology was nothing but the hope of Israel. Paul didn't conjure up a new doctrine of eschatology unrelated to, not based upon the Old Testament eschatology. I've been corresponding with someone on YouTube recently. He made the massive mistake of saying, the passing of the law of Moses has nothing to do with the interpretation of 2 Peter chapter 3. It has nothing to do with it because the law passed away in AD 70. Well, he's right there. Absolutely correct. But he's overlooking, and he's a nice guy, seems to be. He's overlooking the fact that Peter says, 2 Peter chapter 3, is reminding his readers that he's drawing from not only the words of the Lord, not only the commandments or the words of the apostles, but he's drawing from the Old Covenant prophets. 2 Peter chapter 3, 1 through 3, or verse 2. Furthermore, he says, guess what? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13, according to his promise. What promise? Well, according to his promise, we look for a new heaven and new earth, wherein dwells righteousness. Where's that promise from? Isaiah 65, 66. So you see, when you admit that the New Testament doctrine of eschatology, the New Testament doctrine of the day of the Lord, 2 Peter 3:10, when you admit that the New Testament doctrine of the new heaven and new earth, or again, 2 Peter 3:13, Revelation 21, is from the Old Testament, guess what that means? Well, it means that if those things haven't been fulfilled, then the old law hasn't passed away, because after all, Jesus said, wait a minute, what did he say? Well, here's what he said. until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. So you see, when we come to this language and we realize that Jesus was using Old Testament apocalyptic language, and we see that Paul is using that identical language, it seems to me that integrity demands that we go, well, they really are directly parallel. That means they're the same. Absolutely the same. And so when we come to Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, and we have the Son of Man sending forth his angels with the sound of the trumpet, with a shout, with a great trumpet, to gather the elect. It came as a shock to me, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe I was just late to the show, but it came as a shock to me to realize that when Jesus was predicting his coming and the gathering of the elect, at the sounding of the great trumpet, that he was drawing directly. Scholars acknowledge this. G.K. Beale, New Testament commentary on the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament, that's not the correct title, admits that in Matthew 24:31, Jesus is citing, drawing on, or to use Richard Hayes's terminology, directly echoing Isaiah 27, 12 and 13. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, the significance of that is that Isaiah 27 is dealing with resurrection, because it talks about Israel having been slain. Now, they weren't slain as individuals. They were slain by being sent into captivity, specifically, in this case, Assyrian captivity. Just like at a later period of time in Ezekiel chapter 37, the prophet is given a vision of the whole house of Israel. Assyria has taken the 10 northern tribes already at the time of Ezekiel 37, but now the Babylonians are going to take the 2 northern or southern tribes. And so Ezekiel is being given this vision of Israel, the whole house of Israel, and they're in the graves. They are dead. But they're not biologically dead, ladies and gentlemen. They are in captivity. So Isaiah 27 has Israel, the 10 northern tribes, if you please, slain by being sent into captivity. You have Ezekiel 37, the whole house of Israel, now including the 2 southern, is also in the graves. They are dead. As I've pointed out many times before, the ancient Hebrews, had more definitions of death that you and I often have and recognize. You see, for Israel, as John Watts says in his commentary on Isaiah, he says there was an umbilical cord of sorts between Israel and the land. For Israel to be removed from the land by being carried off into captivity meant she was dead. Well, guess what? Other scholars recognize that. N.T. Wright recognizes that. Scott McKnight recognizes that. These men recognize that in Israel's mentality, to be in captivity, to be separated from the land, the city, the temple, was to be dead. It's just good Hebraic thought. So Isaiah 27 is dealing with Israel being dead, captivity. But in Isaiah chapter 27, 12 and 13, the Lord said that in the last days, he was going to regather them. And he said, I will thresh, harvest, this is harvest, I will thresh from Egypt until, and I will gather you. Now, here's what's critical, folks. This is exciting, too. He uses in the Septuagint, I will gather you one by one. He uses, again, in the Septuagint, the Greek word Episunagogee. Now, Episunagogee is a tremendously important eschatological word. Episunagogee is just another word for, not in all cases, so don't misunderstand me, but episunagogee is a word that is used, especially in this context, to speak of resurrection. Remember, Israel's dead. They're scattered to Egypt, Pathros, Cush, etc. But God said, I'm going to gather you. And what would he do? How would he do it? With the great sound of the trumpet, or with the sound of the great trumpet, whichever you prefer. So the gathering of the dead of Israel would occur at the time of the sounding of the great trumpet. By the way, do you realize that Jesus in John chapter 11, 51, 52, said he came to gather the elect that are scattered abroad? Episunagogee. And in Matthew 24, what does he say? The Son of Man will come. He will send forth his angels with a shout, with the sound of the great trumpet, and they shall gather the elect. Let me state this as simply as possible. Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, by speaking of the gathering at the time of the sound of the great trumpet, drawing directly on Isaiah chapter 27, was predicting the resurrection. When did he say it was going to happen? By the way, I develop all of this in depth in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. So here we have Jesus in Matthew 24, 31, drawing on the old covenant promises of the resurrection. Listen, the resurrection of Isaiah 27 is the same resurrection of Isaiah 26, 9 and following. It's the same resurrection of Isaiah 25, verse 8, which Paul was anticipating in 1 Corinthians 15, 56. It's a harmonious, united discourse and prediction of the resurrection. So when the amillennialist and when the postmillennialist say, oh, yeah, Matthew chapter 24, 31, fulfilled in AD 70, or they like to say very often, this is the position Gary DeMar has espoused, Kenneth Gentry has taken this view. They say, well, you see, in Matthew chapter 24, 30 and 31, we have the beginning of the harvest in the Christian age. And that's still ongoing. No, it's the harvest of the old covenant age, just like in Matthew chapter 13, that at the end of the age, the Son of Man would send forth his angels. At the time of the harvest is at the end of the age. I wonder if that's a different harvest from Matthew 24, 30 and 31. No, it's not. Same harvest. Or if you want to make the claim that it is, you got to prove it. And you can't. So what does that mean, ladies and gentlemen? It means that in Matthew 24, 29 to 31, we have an unequivocal, undeniable prediction that the resurrection was to be at the coming of the Son of Man in AD 70. To me, this is incredibly powerful. I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining me on this morning's Morning Music. Don't forget, on Friday, I will be with you for my morning musings, responding to Steve Gregg. Now, I will not be able to be with you on Saturday with Mike Sullivan as we continue our preterist apologetics. Just simply cannot be with you, and I apologize for that. We'll pick it up, Lord willing, very next week. All right? Have a fantastic week. Have a fantastic weekend. See you on the flip side.